Welcome, gentle traveler, to another journey into the soft, quiet world of the past. Tonight, as the world outside grows still and the stars begin their silent watch, we will venture into one of the most profound and fascinating aspects of ancient Egyptian civilization, their intricate and deeply held beliefs about death and the afterlife. Let the gentle flow of the Nile be our guide as we explore a world where death was not an end, but a transition, a sacred passage to an eternal existence. So, before we cross into the ancient world, take a moment to like this video, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and subscribe if you'd like to join me on more journeys through history. Leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in tonight and what time zone is keeping you company. There's something beautiful about how these voices from antiquity unite us across time and distance. As you find your comfortable place and allow your body to relax, imagine standing at the edge of the vast desert, where the golden sands meet the fertile black land of the Nile Valley. Here, the Egyptians built their eternal homes, their tombs, and pyramids, monuments that stand as a testament to their unwavering faith in a life beyond this one. The air is cool and still, filled with the scent of ancient stone and the quiet whispers of millennia. Tonight, we will not fear the darkness, but embrace it as the Egyptians did, as a gateway to a world of light, peace, and everlasting life. Our journey will take us through the sacred rituals of mummification, the solemn processions to the tomb, and the perilous journey through the underworld. We will witness the final judgment, where the heart is weighed against a feather, and explore the blissful paradise of the field of reeds. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the story of eternity unfold. A story designed to soothe your mind and guide you gently into a peaceful, restorative sleep. To comprehend the Egyptian approach to death, one must first understand their complex and beautiful conception of the human soul. For the ancient Egyptians, the soul was not a single, simple entity, but a composite of several distinct spiritual components, each with its own unique function and destiny. The three most important of these were the Ka, the Ba, and the Ak, understanding. These concepts is the key to unlocking the entire philosophy behind their elaborate funerary practices. The Ka was, in essence, a person's life force or spiritual double. It was created at the moment of birth, fashioned by the ram-headed god Khummum on his potter's wheel at the same time he formed the physical body. The Ka was an exact replica of the person, both in appearance and in character, but it was purely spiritual. After death, the Ka separated from the body and traveled to the afterlife. However, it still required sustenance to survive. This is the fundamental reason for the offerings of food, drink, and other goods that were placed in Egyptian tombs. The images of food and drink, carved and painted on the tomb walls, were not merely decorative. They were magical substitutes that the Ka could consume for all eternity, ensuring its survival in the next world. The tomb itself was known as the Het Ka, or the House of the Ka, a permanent home where the life force could reside and receive its offerings. The Ba is often translated as soul or personality, and it is perhaps the component most similar to the Western concept of the soul. The Ba represented the unique character and individuality of a person, everything that made them who they were, including their personality, intellect, and emotions. Unlike the Ka, which was bound to the tomb, The Ba was mobile. It was often depicted as a human-headed bird, a form that symbolized its ability to travel between the world of the living and the underworld. During the day, the Ba could leave the tomb and fly out into the world, visiting the places and people it had loved in life. It could perch on the roof of its former home, watch its descendants, and enjoy the warmth of the sun. At night, however, the Ba had to return to the tomb to be reunited with its physical body, or its mummy, and its Ka. This nightly reunion was essential for the continued existence of the deceased. If the Ba could not find its way back to the body, the soul would be lost forever. This is why the preservation of the physical body through mummification was so critically important. The third component, the Ak, was the transfigured, glorified form of the deceased that existed in the celestial realm. The Ak was the ultimate goal of the spiritual journey after death. It was only after the deceased had successfully passed all the trials of the underworld and been judged worthy in the Hall of Two Truths that the Ka and Ba could unite to form the Ak. The Ak was an immortal, divine being, a shining spirit that could dwell among the gods and the imperishable stars. It was often depicted as a crested ibis, a symbol of divine wisdom and magic. The Ak was a being of pure light, free from the needs and limitations of the physical world. The funerary texts, such as the Book of the Dead, were essentially guidebooks filled with the spells and knowledge needed to achieve this transformation, to become an Ak and take one's place in the eternal cosmos. Beyond these three primary components, there were others that played a role in the Egyptian understanding of the self. The Shut, or shadow, was considered an essential part of a person, always present and connected to them. Like the Ba, the shadow was believed to be able to move about after death. The Sekhem was the life force, or personal power of an individual. And, of course, there was the Ren, the name. The name was not just a label, but a vital part of one's identity. To have one's name remembered and spoken was to continue to exist. This is why names were so prominently carved on tombs and monuments. Conversely, to have one's name hacked out or forgotten was to be condemned to non-existence, a fate considered worse than death itself. The intricate interplay of these spiritual parts shaped every aspect of Egyptian funerary culture. The tomb was the house for the Ka, providing it with eternal sustenance. The mummy was the anchor for the Ba, ensuring it had a physical home to return to each night. The funerary texts were the map for the Ak, guiding it on its journey to divinity. Every ritual, every offering, every spell was designed to protect and nourish these different facets of the soul, ensuring a safe and successful transition from the mortal world to the eternal paradise that awaited the righteous dot. To understand what ancient Egyptians truly feared, we must abandon our modern understanding of death. Physical death was merely transition, a doorway to another existence. What they feared was the second death, complete soul annihilation. The second death was absolute erasure from all reality. This wasn't simply being forgotten by living people. Egyptians believed existence depended on being remembered, spoken of, acknowledged. When a person's name was no longer spoken, their soul would weaken in the afterlife. The process was gradual. First, afterlife offerings became less substantial. Bread tasted like sand. Beer lost strength. Then their form would fade. becoming translucent. Finally, they would cease existing entirely, as if never born. This was why Egyptians obsessed over preserving names and memories. Every statue, inscription, mummy, was a weapon against the second death, ensuring continued remembrance and existence. The wealthy afforded elaborate tombs with inscriptions and endowments, ensuring priests would speak their names for generations. The poor developed community solutions. Village priests maintained lists of local dead. Families passed down stories. Simple grave markers served as memory anchors. This fear drove Egyptians to live memorable lives worth preserving, but also created terrible anxiety. No matter how successful, there was always possibility of being forgotten. Everything Egyptians did, every ritual, preparation, aimed at avoiding this fate. The underworld journey, heart-weighing, afterlife trials, were all preferable to absolute nothingness. The central pillar of the Egyptian preparation for the afterlife was the physical preservation of the body through the sacred art of mummification. The Egyptians believed that the ba, or soul, needed to be able to recognize and reunite with its physical form each night. If the body decayed, the ba would be lost, and the deceased's chance at eternal life would be jeopardized. This belief gave rise to one of the most sophisticated and enduring preservation techniques in human history. The practice of mummification evolved over thousands of years. In the earliest periods, the dead were simply buried in shallow pits in the hot, dry desert sand. The natural conditions of the desert would desiccate the bodies, creating natural mummies. As burial practices became more elaborate, with the construction of tombs and the use of coffins, the bodies were no longer in direct contact with the sand, and natural preservation ceased. This necessitated the development of artificial mummification techniques to replicate and improve upon what nature had once done automatically. The full, classic process of mummification, as perfected during the New Kingdom, was a lengthy and complex affair, lasting for 70 days. It was performed by a specialized class of priests in a dedicated workshop known as the wabbit, or place of purification. The chief embalmer, known as the Hebe, wore a jackal mask to represent Anubis, the god of mummification, as he performed his sacred duties. The process began with the purification of the body. It was washed with palm wine, which had antiseptic properties, and then rinsed with water from the Nile. The first and most crucial step was the removal of the internal organs, which are the first parts of the body to decompose. A small incision was made on the left side of the abdomen, and through this opening, the stomach, intestines, liver, and lungs were carefully removed. Each organ was individually washed, treated with resins, and wrapped in linen. These wrapped organs were then placed into 4 special containers, known as canopic jars. Each jar was protected by one of the 4 sons of the god Horus. Imsidi, with a human head, guarded the liver. Hapi, with a baboon head, protected the lungs. Duamutef, with a jackal head, watched over the stomach. And Kibasenif, with a falcon head, cared for the intestines. These jars would be placed in the tomb alongside the coffin. The heart, however, was left inside the body. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence, emotion, and memory, the very essence of the individual. It was essential for the final judgment in the afterlife, where it would be weighed against the feather of Mat, the goddess of truth and justice. To remove the heart would be to rob the deceased of their identity and their chance at eternal life. The brain was the one organ that the Egyptians did not consider important. They believed it was simply the origin of mucus and had no significant function. It was removed through the nostrils using long, hooked instruments. The embalmers would carefully break through the thin ethmoid bone at the back of the nose, and then use the hooks to pull the brain out in small pieces. The cranial cavity was then rinsed with palm wine and filled with linen strips or resin to prevent it from collapsing. Once the organs were removed, the body cavity was thoroughly cleaned and sterilized with palm wine and a concoction of spices. The next and longest phase of the process was dehydration. The body was completely covered, both inside and out, with natron, a natural salt mixture harvested from the dry lake beds of the Wadi El Natron. Natron, a compound of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, was a powerful, desiccating agent. The body was left packed in a mound of natron for 40 days, during which time the salt would draw out all the moisture from the tissues, preventing decay and bacterial growth. After the 40-day dehydration period, the body was removed from the natron bed. It would be shrunken, wrinkled, and leathery, but perfectly preserved. The embalmers would then wash the body once more to remove the salt and begin the process of restoring a more lifelike appearance. The body cavities were packed with linen, sawdust, or other materials to restore its shape and form. False eyes, often made of stone or painted onions, were placed in the eye sockets. The skin was anointed with a mixture of fragrant oils, resins, and unguents to make it more supple and to give it a pleasant scent. The final stage was the wrapping. This was a meticulous and ritualistic process that could take up to 15 days. Hundreds of yards of fine linen strips were used to wrap the body. The process was done with great care, with each finger and toe being wrapped individually before the limbs and torso were wrapped as a whole. As the layers of bandages were applied, priests would recite incantations and place magical amulets within the wrappings to protect the deceased on their journey. Through the underworld, amulets like the Ankh, symbol of life, the Jed pillar, symbol of stability, and the scarab beetle, symbol of rebirth, were strategically placed over different parts of the body. A special heart scarab, inscribed with a spell from the Book of the Dead, was often placed over the heart to prevent it from testifying against the deceased during the final judgment. Finally, a funerary mask was placed over the head and shoulders of the mummy. For pharaohs and the very wealthy, this mask would be made of solid gold, like the famous mask of Tutankhamun. For others, it might be made of cartonnageliers of linen or papyrus stiffened with plaster and then painted or gilded. The mask was not just a portrait, but a magical substitute for the head, ensuring the BA would always recognize its home. The fully wrapped and masked mummy was then placed into a series of nested coffins, each elaborately decorated with spells and images of protective deities, before being ready for its final journey to the tomb. With the 70-day period of mummification complete, the deceased was ready for their final journey to their eternal home. The tomb, which was almost always located on the west bank of the Nile, the West, the land of the setting sun, was symbolically the land of the dead, and the funeral was a grand, public spectacle that transitioned the deceased from the world of the living to the realm of the ancestors. The funeral procession was a carefully orchestrated event filled with both solemn ritual and expressions of profound grief. It began at the deceased's home or the embalming workshop. The mummy, enclosed within its elaborate coffins, was placed upon a funerary sledge, often shaped like a sacred bark or boat, which would be pulled by oxen or a team of mourners. Leading the procession were priests who would burn incense and sprinkle milk, symbolizing purification and nourishment for the journey ahead. Following the priests was the family of the deceased, displaying their grief in a highly ritualized manner. Close female relatives, in particular, would take on the roles of the divine mourners, the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, who had mourned their beloved brother and husband, Osiris. They would wail loudly, beat their chests, and throw dust upon their heads, enacting the sorrow of the gods. Professional mourners, known as kites, were often hired to amplify this display of grief, their piercing cries filling the air and demonstrating the high esteem in which the deceased was held. Behind the family came a long train of servants and porters, carrying all the worldly goods that would be placed in the tomb for the deceased to use in the afterlife. This funerary equipment, known as the kikare, included furniture, clothing, jewelry, tools, weapons, and, of course, the canopic jars containing the preserved organs. The quantity and quality of these goods were a direct reflection of the deceased's wealth and status. For a pharaoh, this procession would be a truly magnificent spectacle, involving thousands of people and a treasure trove of priceless objects. The procession would make its way to the banks of the Nile, where a flotilla of boats awaited. The mummy and its immediate family would board a ceremonial funerary bark to be ferried across the river to the west bank. Other boats would carry the priests, the mourners, and the vast array of tomb goods. This crossing of the Nile was deeply symbolic, representing the journey across the waters that separated the land of the living from the land of the dead. Upon reaching the west bank, the procession would reform and proceed to the tomb located in the necropolis, the city of the dead. As they approached the tomb's entrance, the most important ritual of the funeral took place, the opening of the mouth ceremony. This was a magical rite performed by a special priest, often the deceased's eldest son and heir, who took on the role of Horus. The purpose of the ceremony was to reanimate the mummy, to magically restore its ability to see, hear, speak, and eat in the afterlife. The priest would use a series of special instruments, including an adze, a ritual knife, and a serpent-headed tool, to touch the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose of the mummy, or its coffin, or a statue representing the deceased. As he touched each part, he would recite powerful spells. By touching the mouth, he restored the ability to speak and eat. By touching the eyes, he restored sight. This ritual was believed to transform the inert mummy into a living spiritual entity, a vessel capable of housing the Ka and Ba and partaking in the eternal offerings. After the opening of the mouth ceremony was complete, the mummy was carried into the tomb and placed within its sarcophagus in the burial chamber. The vast collection of funerary goods was carefully arranged around it, creating a complete, functional household for the afterlife. The canopic jars were placed in their own special chest, and magical texts and papyri, like the Book of the Dead, were positioned to provide guidance for the journey ahead. With everything in its proper place, the final rites were performed. Priests would recite the last protective spells, and the tomb would be ritually sealed. The entrance was blocked with stones and plastered over, often stamped with the seal of the royal necropolis. To deter tomb robbers, the living then departed, leaving the deceased to begin their solitary journey through the underworld. A funerary feast was often held near the tomb, a final act of communion between the living and the dead, celebrating the successful transition of the loved one into the realm of the blessed ancestors. For the family, the funeral was not a final goodbye, but the beginning of a new relationship, one in which they would continue to honor and provide for their deceased relative through offerings and festivals for generations to come. The tomb in ancient Egypt was far more than a simple burial place. It was the house of eternity, a permanent dwelling for the Ka and a magical interface between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The evolution of tomb architecture, from simple sand pits to the colossal pyramids, reflects the increasing sophistication of Egyptian religious beliefs and their unwavering commitment to ensuring a prosperous afterlife. In the pre-dynastic period, the dead were buried in simple oval pits dug in the desert sand. The body was placed in a fetal position, surrounded by a few grave goods, like pottery jars containing food and drink. The natural desiccation of the desert preserved these bodies, which may have inspired the later belief in the importance of physical preservation. As society became more complex, these simple pits evolved into more structured tombs lined with mud brick, known as mastabas. A mastaba, an Arabic word for bench, was a rectangular, flat-topped structure built over a subterranean burial chamber. The above-ground structure served as a chapel and a place for offerings. It contained a small room called a serdab, housed a statue of the deceased. A small opening or false door was carved into the wall, acting as a magical portal through which the Ka could pass to receive the offerings left by the living. The actual burial chamber was deep underground, connected to the chapel by a vertical shaft that was sealed after the burial. The great leap in tomb architecture came during the Third Dynasty with the architect Imhotep, who served King Djoser. Imhotep conceived the revolutionary idea of stacking several mastabas of decreasing size on top of one another, creating the world's first monumental stone structure, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. This was not just a tomb, but a massive complex, a veritable city for the dead king, complete with temples, courtyards, and storehouses, all surrounded by a massive enclosure wall. The Step Pyramid was a stairway to the heavens, a physical representation of the king's ascent to join the gods. The true pyramid form, with its smooth, sloping sides, was perfected during the Fourth Dynasty. These were not just tombs, but cosmic engines, designed to magically project the pharaoh's soul to the heavens to join the sun god Ra on his daily journey across the sky. The sheer scale and precision of the pyramids are a testament to the immense resources and organizational power of the Old Kingdom state, all marshaled for the singular purpose of ensuring the king's eternal life. The interior of a pyramid contained a series of chambers and passages, including the burial chamber where the pharaoh's sarcophagus was placed. The walls of the later Old Kingdom pyramids were inscribed with the pyramid texts, the earliest collection of religious spells designed to protect the pharaoh and guide him into the afterlife. By the time of the New Kingdom, the pyramid form was largely abandoned for royal burials, primarily due to the threat of tomb robbery. The pharaohs instead chose to be buried in deep, rock-cut tombs, hidden away in a remote desert valley on the west bank of Thebes, the Valley of the Kings. Here, for nearly 500 years, Egypt's rulers were laid to rest in elaborate subterranean tombs, their entrances concealed to protect them from desecration. The typical tomb in the Valley of the Kings consisted of a long, sloping corridor that descended deep into the earth, punctuated by a series of antechambers, pillared halls, and storerooms, culminating in the burial chamber. The layout was intended to represent the journey through the underworld. The walls of these tombs were covered from floor to ceiling with vibrant, detailed paintings and hieroglyphic texts. These were not mere decorations, but powerful magical tools. The images depicted scenes from the afterlife, showing the deceased king interacting with the gods and successfully navigating the dangers of the underworld. The texts were spells from funerary compositions like the Book of the Dead, the Amd, and the Book of Gates, providing the king with the magical knowledge needed to overcome obstacles and achieve rebirth. The treasures placed within these tombs were staggering. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter provided a breathtaking glimpse into the wealth that accompanied a pharaoh into the afterlife. The tomb was filled with thousands of objects, golden shrines and coffins, jewelry of lapis, lazuli, and carnelian, alabaster vases, ornate furniture, chariots, weapons, clothing, and even food and wine. Every object was intended for the king's use in the next world, a complete, eternal version of his royal household. The purpose of this immense wealth was not just luxury, but function. The king needed his chariot to travel, his weapons to hunt, and his furniture to rest, just as he had in life. The gold, which never tarnishes, was a symbol of divinity and eternity, ensuring the objects would last forever. For non-royal but wealthy Egyptians, tombs were smaller but followed similar principles. A noble's tomb would typically have an accessible above-ground chapel for offerings and a hidden burial chamber below. The chapel walls would be decorated with lively scenes from the deceased's daily life, banqueting, hunting in the marshes, overseeing their estates. These scenes were not just biographical, they were magical, intended to ensure that the deceased could continue to enjoy these pleasant activities for all eternity. The tomb was a machine for eternal life, a carefully constructed environment where art, architecture, and magic combined to conquer death itself. Once the tomb was sealed, the deceased's spiritual journey began in earnest. The Egyptian underworld, known as the Duat, was not a place of punishment like the Christian hell, but a complex, perilous landscape that every soul had to traverse to reach the paradise of the afterlife. It was a realm of darkness, filled with fearsome demons, fiery lakes, and gates guarded by terrifying supernatural beings. To navigate this treacherous realm successfully required courage, knowledge, and, most importantly, magic, the primary tool. For this journey was the Book of the Dead, a modern name for a collection of ancient Egyptian funerary spells. The Egyptians called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day. It was not a single, standardized book, but a personalized collection of spells, written on a papyrus scroll, which was placed in the coffin with the mummy. Each spell was designed to help the deceased overcome a specific obstacle or challenge in the duat. The journey was often conceived as a nocturnal voyage, mirroring the journey of the sun god Ra, who traveled through the underworld each night after setting in the west. The deceased would join Ra on his solar bark, and together they would navigate the 12 hours of the night, each hour representing a different region of the duat, with its own unique dangers and guardians. The spells in the Book of the Dead provided the magical passwords and knowledge needed to pacify the guardians and pass through the gates that separated these regions. One of the first challenges was the crossing of a great river. The deceased would have to persuade a grumpy, divine ferryman named Mahaf to carry them across. Spells provided the correct words to say, flattering the ferryman and proving one's worthiness to make the crossing. Failure to do so would mean being stranded on the wrong bank for eternity. The duat was populated by a host of terrifying creatures. There were giant serpents like Apep, the arch-enemy of Ra, who tried to swallow the solar bark each night. There were demons armed with knives, crocodiles with human heads, and monstrous beings who lived on the blood of the dead. The spells acted as magical weapons, allowing the deceased to repel these creatures, to become invisible to them, or to transform into a powerful being that could fight them off. For example, Spell 31 allowed the deceased to drive away a crocodile, while Spell 7 gave them power over a snake. Beyond monstrous demons, the deceased also had to face a series of gates, each guarded by a fearsome entity. The Book of Gates, another funerary text, describes 21 such gates, each with its own name and a guardian with a terrifying title, like he who lives on snakes or he who dances in blood. To pass, the deceased had to address each guardian by its correct name, a demonstration of their magical knowledge and spiritual purity. The tomb paintings in the Valley of the Kings often depict these gates and their guardians in vivid detail, serving as a visual guide for the deceased pharaoh. Another significant challenge was the risk of losing one's memory or one's mouth, which would render the deceased unable to speak the magical spells. Spell 23, the spell for opening the mouth of a person in the god's domain, ensured the deceased could speak, while other spells protected their heart and their name from being taken away. There were even spells to ensure one would not have to eat feces or drink urine, a very real fear for those who failed the trials of the underworld. Throughout this journey, the deceased was not alone. They were protected by various gods who also traveled with Ra on the solar bark. Deities like Seth, who was a powerful protector despite his chaotic nature, would help fight off Apep Thoth, the god of wisdom and magic, provided the knowledge of the sacred spells. The ultimate goal of this perilous journey was to reach the final destination, the Hall of Two Truths, where the ultimate judgment would take place. The entire journey through the duat was a process of purification and transformation, a rite of passage that tested the soul's worthiness to enter the eternal paradise. The Egyptians discovered a cheat code for the afterlife's secret knowledge, guaranteeing safe passage regardless of wealth or perfect moral living. This knowledge was contained in the Book of the Dead. This wasn't religious reading, but practical manual step-by-step guide, providing specific instructions for overcoming every obstacle, defeating every demon, passing every test. It was literally an afterlife cheat sheet. the crucial understanding. The afterlife operated according to specific rules that could be learned and exploited. Demons and guardians were cosmic bureaucrats with specific procedures. Knowing the right words, names, and procedures meant successful navigation. When encountering gate guardians, the deceased couldn't fight or sneak past. They had to know secret names and passwords. The book provided these, along with detailed descriptions of each guardian. Most crucial was understanding how heart-weighing actually worked. This wasn't simply moral judgment, but knowledge and preparation. The deceased had to know what to say to Anubis, how to address 42 judges, and how to recite the negative confession. Here's the secret. The negative confession wasn't necessarily truthful accounting, but ritual formula that, when recited correctly, would magically purify the heart. The power wasn't in truth, but in knowing correct words and proper method. The knowledge included detailed underworld maps showing which paths to take and avoid. The underworld was vast, with multiple levels, countless chambers, numerous routes, some leading to bliss, others to punishment or annihilation. Most importantly, the knowledge included true names of underworld gods and demons. Knowing someone's true name gave power over them. The book revealed secret names of powerful deities, allowing the deceased to command respect rather than hope for mercy. This knowledge had to be learned during life. Wealthy Egyptians spent years studying with priests, memorizing spells and procedures. Remarkably, this system was eventually democratized. Even middle-class Egyptians could purchase abbreviated versions. The psychological impact was profound. Imagine the confidence from knowing you had tools for successful afterlife navigation. Death remained frightening, but was no longer unknown. Was a journey with detailed map and necessary passwords. After successfully navigating the treacherous paths of the duat, the deceased arrived at the most critical moment of their entire existence, the final judgment in the Hall of Two Truths. This was the ultimate test, a divine tribunal that would determine their eternal fate. The scene of this judgment is one of the most iconic and frequently depicted images in Egyptian funerary art, most famously in the Papyrus of Ani. The Hall of Two Truths was a vast, sacred chamber presided over by the great god Osiris, the lord of the underworld, seated on his throne. Along the walls of the hall sat a tribunal of 42 assessor gods, each representing one of the nomes, or provinces, of Egypt. Each of these gods was responsible for judging a specific type of sin. Upon entering the hall, the deceased had to prove their moral purity. They did this by reciting a series of declarations known as the negative confession. They would address each of the 42 gods by name and declare that they were innocent of a particular sign. These declarations covered a wide range of moral and ethical transgressions. The deceased would state, "I have not committed sin. I have not committed robbery with violence. I have not stolen. I have not slain men and women. I have not told lies. I have not been an eavesdropper. I have not made anyone weep," and so on. This was not a confession of guilt, but a powerful magical declaration of innocence, asserting that the deceased had lived a life in accordance with Matha, divine principle of truth, justice, and cosmic order. After the negative confession, the climax of the judgment began, the weighing of the heart of the deceased, which had been carefully left in the mummy, was placed on one side of a great golden scale. On the other side of the scale was a single ostrich feather, the symbol of Mat. The heart, as the seat of the intellect and conscience, was the record of all the person's thoughts and deeds in life. The weighing was a test to see if the person's life had been lived in balance and harmony with truth and justice. The god Anubis, the jackal-headed conductor of souls, would perform the weighing, carefully adjusting the scales. The god Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods, stood ready with his palette and red pen to record the result. If the heart was heavy with sin, it would outweigh the feather. If the person had lived a virtuous life, their heart would be light and pure, and it would balance perfectly with the feather. This was a moment of supreme anxiety. To ensure a favorable outcome, the deceased relied on a special amulet, the heart scarab, which had been placed over their heart during the mummification process. Inscribed on the scarab was spell 30b from the Book of the Dead, which was a direct appeal to the heart itself. O my heart, which I had from my mother, O my heart of my different ages, do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not be opposed to me in the tribunal. Do not be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the balance. This spell was a magical safeguard, preventing the heart from betraying the deceased at this crucial moment. If the heart was heavier than the feather, the soul was condemned. Waiting eagerly beside the scales was a terrifying creature named Ammit, the devourer of the dead. Ammit was a composite monster with the head of a crocodile, the form of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, the three largest man-eating animals known to the Egyptians. If the judgment was unfavorable, Ammit would devour the heart, and the soul of the deceased would be utterly destroyed, ceasing to exist for all eternity. This was the second death, the ultimate horror for an Egyptian. But if the heart balanced with the feather, a great cry of joy would erupt from the gods. The deceased was declared Makeru, meaning true of voice or justified. Thoth would record the verdict, and the god Horus would then take the justified soul by the hand and lead them forward to the throne of Osiris. Osiris, the merciful king of the dead, would welcome them into his eternal kingdom. Having passed the final judgment, the soul was now free to enter the paradise of the afterlife, the field of reeds. For the soul that had been declared true of voice, the perils of the underworld were over, and the gates to paradise were opened. The Egyptian afterlife, known as the Aru, or the field of reeds, was not a place of ethereal, disembodied bliss, but a tangible, idealized version of the life they had known along the Nile. The field of reeds was envisioned as a vast, fertile land, a perfect reflection of the Egyptian landscape. It was a place of lush fields, abundant crops, and cool, life-giving canals. The sun always shone, the harvests were always bountiful, and there was no sickness, no sorrow, and no pain. It was, in essence, a perfect, eternal Egypt. Upon entering the field of reeds, the justified soul was reunited with all the things they had loved in life. They would meet with their family and friends who had passed on before them, living together in a joyous, eternal reunion. They would be greeted by their beloved pets, who had also been granted passage to this paradise. The tomb paintings of nobles often depict these happy reunions, showing husbands and wives embracing and families sitting together in beautiful gardens. Life in the field of reeds was a life of eternal leisure and pleasure, but it was not entirely without work. The Egyptians believed that even in paradise, the gods might call upon the deceased to perform labor, such as tilling the fields or maintaining the irrigation canals. However, the Egyptians, ever practicable, found a magical way to avoid this eternal toil. They placed small, mummiform figurines called shabdis or ushabtis in their tombs. These were magical servant statues, and each was inscribed with a spell from the Book of the Dead, spell 6. The spell commanded the shabdi to answer in the deceased's place if they were ever called upon to work. The shabdi would say, "Here I am," and would then perform the required labor, leaving the deceased free to enjoy their eternal leisure. A wealthy person might be buried with 365 shabdis, one for every day of the year, along with 36 overseer shabdis to keep them organized, creating a complete workforce for the afterlife. Freed from any obligation of labor, the deceased could spend eternity enjoying their favorite pastimes. They could go hunting and fowling in the abundant marshes, just as they had in life. They could go fishing in the clear, cool waters. They could feast on an endless supply of delicious food and drink, including bread, beer, wine, roasted meats, and sweet fruits. They could play their favorite board games, like Sonnet, a game that was itself symbolic of the journey through the afterlife. They could relax in the shade of sycamore trees, listen to beautiful music, and enjoy the company of their loved ones. The field of reeds was not just a paradise for mortals. It was also the realm of the gods. The justified soul had the privilege of living among the deities, seeing them face to face, and participating in their divine activities. They could join the entourage of Osiris, the benevolent king, or travel across the sky with Ra in his solar bark, witnessing the daily miracle of sunrise and sunset. This proximity to the gods was the ultimate reward, a confirmation of the soul's transformation into a divine, eternal being, an Akh. The environment itself was perfect. The weather was always pleasant, the breeze was always gentle, and the air was filled with the scent of lotus blossoms. The crops grew to an incredible height, and the harvests were effortlessly gathered. It was a world without want, without conflict, and without end. This vision of paradise was a powerful motivator for the Egyptians to live a righteous life in accordance with Mat. The promise of the field of reeds was not just an escape from death, but the ultimate fulfillment of everything that was good and beautiful about life itself. The relationship between the living and the dead did not end with the sealing of the tomb. In fact, it entered a new ongoing phase that was crucial for the well-being of both parties. The deceased, now an ancestor, depended on the living for continued sustenance and remembrance, while the living looked to their ancestors for protection, guidance, and blessings. This reciprocal relationship was maintained through the cult of the dead, a series of rituals and festivals that kept the memory of the ancestors alive. The primary duty of the living was to provide offerings for the Ka of the deceased. This responsibility typically fell to the eldest son, who acted as the Ka servant. On a regular basis, he would visit the tomb chapel and present offerings of food, drink, incense, and flowers. He would recite the offering formula, a prayer that magically transformed the physical offerings into spiritual sustenance for the Ka. This was not seen as a chore, but as a sacred duty and a way of maintaining a loving connection with the departed family member. for those who could afford it. A permanent priesthood could be endowed to perform these rituals in perpetuity. A family would set aside a portion of their land or wealth, and the income from it would be used to pay a co-priest to perform the daily offering rituals at the tomb. This ensured that the deceased would be cared for, even if their direct descendants forgot their duties or the family line died out. Beyond the regular offerings, there were great public festivals that celebrated the dead. The most important of these was the beautiful Feast of the Valley. Once a year, the cult statue of the god Amun-Ra would be carried out of the great temple. At Karnak, in a grand procession, it would cross the Nile to the west bank and visit the mortuary temples of the deceased, pharaohs, and the necropolis where the nobles were buried. This was a time of great celebration. Families would travel to the tombs of their ancestors, camping out in the necropolis for the night. They would hold a great feast in the tomb chapels, sharing a meal with their departed relatives, leave offerings, light lamps, and tell stories, blurring the boundary between the living and the dead in a joyous, communal celebration. It was a time to remember the ancestors, to honor their memory, and to feel their continued presence and protection. Another important festival was the Wag Festival, which was dedicated to Osiris and the blessed dead. It was a more solemn occasion, a time for reflection and for performing the specific rituals that ensured the well-being of the ancestors in the underworld. The ancestors were not seen as distant, powerless spirits. They were believed to be active and influential members of the extended family. The living would often communicate with their dead relatives through letters to the dead. These were messages written on pottery bowls or papyrus, which were left at the tomb. People would write to their deceased parents or spouses, asking for help with problems, a legal dispute, an illness, or a desire to have a child. They believed that their ancestors, now powerful Ox in the afterlife, could intercede with the gods on their behalf or directly influence events in the world of the living. These letters reveal a deep and personal connection, showing that family bonds were believed to transcend even death itself. This constant remembrance and interaction had a profound impact on Egyptian society. It created a powerful sense of continuity, a connection that stretched back through countless generations. It reinforced the importance of family and lineage, and it provided a strong moral framework for daily life. Knowing that one's deeds were being watched by the ancestors, and that one would one day join them and be judged, was a powerful incentive to live a life of virtue and honor. The cult of the dead was the social glue that bound Egyptian society together, connecting the past, the present, and the future in a single, unbroken chain of existence. While the promise of the field of reeds was the ultimate hope for every Egyptian, there was also a profound fear of what would happen to those who failed the final judgment. The fate of the wicked was not eternal torment in a fiery hell, but something far worse in the Egyptian mindset, complete and utter annihilation. This was the second death, the final end of existence, from which there was no escape and no rebirth, as we saw in the Hall of Two Truths. The heart of the person who had lived a life contrary to Mat would be heavy with sin and would outweigh the feather of truth. When this happened, the heart was thrown to the monstrous devourer, Ammit. The consumption of the heart by Ammit was the first step in the soul's destruction. Without the heart, the seat of its identity, the soul could know. longer exist as a complete entity. The various components of the soul would then be scattered and destroyed. The Ba would have no home to return to. The Kie would starve without offerings, and the chance to become a glorified Ak was lost forever. The name of the wicked person would be blotted out from memory, and their shadow would be consumed by darkness. They would be erased from the cosmic record, as if they had never been. Funerary texts and tomb paintings sometimes depict the punishments that awaited the truly wicked in the underworld before their final annihilation. These were not places of eternal suffering, but rather way stations on the path to non-existence. There were fiery lakes, pits of snakes, and demons who would dismember the souls of the damned. The wicked might be forced to walk upside down and eat their own excrement. These terrifying images served as a powerful warning to the living, a stark reminder of the consequences of living a life of chaos and injustice. The concept of the second death highlights the core of Egyptian morality. The ultimate goal was not just to live forever, but to live on as a complete, remembered, and honored individual. Annihilation was the ultimate punishment because it meant the loss of self, the loss of memory, and the loss of one's place in the eternal order of the cosmos. This fear of non-existence was a far more powerful motivator than the fear of eternal pain. It drove the Egyptians to live righteously, to build lasting monuments, to have their names inscribed in stone, and to ensure that their descendants would continue their mortuary cult, all in a desperate and beautiful effort to conquer oblivion. As our exploration of the Egyptian afterlife comes to a close, and the first light of dawn begins to touch the horizon, we are left with the enduring legacy of a civilization that dedicated so much of its energy, creativity, and resources to the conquest of death. The pyramids that still stand against the desert sky, the golden treasures that gleam in museums around the world, and the intricate hieroglyphs that tell the stories of gods and souls are all echoes of this profound and unwavering belief in eternal life. The Egyptian vision of the afterlife was not born of a fear of death, but of a deep love of life. Their paradise, the field of reeds, was a perfect reflection of the world they knew and cherished, a world of family, community, good food, and meaningful activity. They did not wish to escape life, but to continue it, perfected and eternal. This optimistic and life-affirming view is perhaps their greatest legacy. Their sophisticated understanding of the soul, with its multiple components, like the Ka and Ba, reveals a deep psychological insight into the nature of human identity. Their development of mummification was a triumph of practical science, born from a spiritual need. Their funerary texts, like the Book of the Dead, are not just collections of magical spells, but profound works of theology and moral philosophy, grappling with the fundamental questions of good and evil, justice, and the nature of existence. As you drift now into the final, deepest stages of your sleep, let the quiet wisdom of the ancient Egyptians settle in your mind. Their journey through the Duat can be seen as a metaphor for our own passage through the challenges of life. Their belief in the weighing of the heart is a timeless reminder of the importance of living with integrity, kindness, and truth. And their vision of an eternal reunion with loved ones in a perfect world is a universal human hope that resonates across the ages. The ancient Egyptians are gone. Their civilization has passed into history. but their quest for eternity was, in a way, successful. Through the magnificent monuments they built and the rich records they left behind, they have achieved a form of immortality. They are remembered, their names are spoken, and their stories continue to fascinate and inspire us. Thousands of years after the last pharaoh ruled, they have, in a very real sense, come forth by day. And so, as you rest, may you find your own field of reeds, a place of peace, tranquility, and perfect, restorative sleep. The death of a pharaoh was not merely the passing of a mortal ruler, but a cosmic event that shook the very foundations of Egyptian society. The pharaoh was not just a king, but a living god, the earthly embodiment of Horus, and his death represented a critical moment when the divine order itself was threatened. The elaborate rituals surrounding royal death and burial were designed not only to ensure the pharaoh's successful transition to the afterlife, but to maintain the stability of the cosmos and the continuity of divine rule. When a pharaoh died, the entire kingdom entered a period of profound mourning and anxiety. The death was announced with the formal proclamation, "The falcon has flown to heaven, and another has risen in his place." This phrase captured the essential Egyptian belief that while the mortal body of the pharaoh had died, his divine essence had ascended to join the gods, and his successor had immediately assumed the divine mantle. The period between the pharaoh's death and his burial was a time of intense activity and careful ritual observance. The body of the pharaoh was immediately taken to the royal embalming workshop, where the most skilled embalmers in the kingdom would begin the sacred process of mummification. For a pharaoh, this process was even more elaborate than for ordinary nobles. The finest materials were used, the purest natron, the most expensive resins and oils, and hundreds of yards of the finest linen. The process could take up to 70 days, during which time the kingdom was in a state of suspended animation, waiting for their god-king to be prepared for his eternal journey. During this period, the new pharaoh, though he had already assumed power, could not be formally crowned until his predecessor had been properly buried. This created a delicate period of transition, where the old order was ending and the new had not yet been fully established. To maintain stability, the royal court would continue to function as if the dead pharaoh were still alive, issuing decrees in his name and maintaining the fiction that he was merely temporarily absent. The funeral of a pharaoh was the most magnificent spectacle in Egyptian society, a grand pageant that could last for days and involve the entire population of the kingdom. The mummified pharaoh, enclosed in a series of nested golden coffins, would be placed on a golden funeral sledge and drawn by a team of oxen through the streets of the capital. The procession would be led by priests burning incense and chanting hymns, followed by the royal family, the court officials, and representatives from every province of Egypt. The route of the funeral procession was carefully planned to take the pharaoh past all the major temples and monuments of his reign, allowing him to bid farewell to the gods and the people he had served. At each temple, special ceremonies would be performed, and offerings would be made to ensure the pharaoh's safe passage to the afterlife. The entire population would line the streets, wailing and mourning the loss of their divine ruler, while also celebrating his transformation into an eternal god. The burial chamber of a pharaoh was a marvel of engineering and artistry, designed to serve as a palace for the god king in the afterlife. The walls were covered with the most sophisticated funerary texts, including the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, and later, the Book of the Dead. These texts were not merely decorative, but were powerful magical tools that would guide the pharaoh through the underworld and ensure his successful rebirth as a god. The treasures buried with a pharaoh were beyond imagination. Golden furniture, jeweled weapons, precious vessels, and thousands of other objects were placed in the tomb to serve the pharaoh in the afterlife. The famous burial of Tutankhamun, though he was a relatively minor pharaoh, contained over 5,000 individual objects, giving us a glimpse of the incredible wealth that was buried with the great pharaohs of Egypt. The pharaoh's journey through the underworld was conceived as being different from that of ordinary mortals. While common people had to navigate the dangers of the duat with the help of spells and amulets, the pharaoh was believed to join the sun god Ra on his nightly journey through the underworld. The pharaoh would become one with Ra, sharing in his divine power and helping to defeat the forces of chaos that threatened the cosmic order. This divine transformation was not just a personal achievement for the pharaoh, but a cosmic necessity. The pharaoh's successful passage through death and his rebirth as a god ensured the continuation of the divine order that maintained the stability of the universe. His transformation into an eternal deity meant that he could continue to protect and guide Egypt from the afterlife, serving as an intermediary between the living and the gods. The cult of the dead pharaoh was maintained for centuries. After his death, his mortuary temple would continue to function, with priests performing daily rituals and making offerings to sustain his ka. The pharaoh's name would be invoked in prayers and ceremonies, and his divine protection would be sought in times of crisis. In this way, the dead pharaoh remained an active and powerful presence in Egyptian society, eternal guardian watching over his people. One of the most remarkable developments in Egyptian religious thought was the gradual democratization of the afterlife. In the earliest periods of Egyptian history, the elaborate rituals and beliefs surrounding death and rebirth were largely reserved for the pharaoh and the royal family. The king alone was believed to become a god after death, while his subjects faced a much more uncertain fate. However, over the course of Egyptian history, these beliefs gradually expanded to include, first, the nobility, then the middle classes, and eventually all Egyptians, regardless of their social status. This transformation began during the Old Kingdom. They built elaborate mastaba tombs near the royal pyramids, filled them. The pyramid texts, originally reserved for pharaohs, began to appear in modified form in the tombs of nobles, adapted to suit their non-royal status. During the chaotic period known as the First Intermediate Period, when central authority collapsed and Egypt was divided among competing rulers, the old certainties about the afterlife were challenged. The traditional belief that only the pharaoh could achieve divine status after death was questioned, and new ideas about the afterlife began to emerge. This period saw the development of the coffin texts, a new collection of funerary spells that were written inside the coffins of nobles and wealthy commoners. These texts democratized the afterlife by providing non-royal individuals with the magical knowledge they needed to navigate the underworld and achieve rebirth. The Middle Kingdom saw the further expansion of afterlife beliefs to include a broader segment of society. The god Osiris, who had originally been associated primarily with the pharaoh, became a more universal deity of the dead. The myth of Osiris, who was murdered by his brother Seth but was resurrected through the love and magic of his wife Isis, became a powerful symbol of hope for all Egyptians. Osiris was not a distant royal deity, but a god who had suffered and died like a mortal, making him more accessible to ordinary people. The identification with Osiris became central to Egyptian afterlife beliefs. Every deceased person, regardless of their social status, could become Osiris's name after death, taking on the identity of the resurrected god. This transformation was not automatic, but required the same moral purity and ritual preparation that had once been reserved for pharaohs. The deceased had to live a life in accordance with Mat, undergo proper mummification, and successfully navigate the trials of the underworld. By the New Kingdom, the democratization of the afterlife was complete. The Book of the Dead, which evolved from the earlier pyramid texts and coffin texts, was available to anyone who could afford to have it copied. Papyrus copies of the Book of the Dead could be purchased from temple scriptoriums, with the buyer's name inserted into the standard spells. Even relatively modest burials from this period include papyrus scrolls with funerary spells, showing that the hope of eternal life had spread throughout Egyptian society. This democratization had profound social and religious implications. It meant that every Egyptian, from the pharaoh to the humblest farmer, shared the same ultimate destiny and faced the same moral requirements. The weighing of the heart applied equally to all, and the field of reeds was open to anyone who lived a righteous life. This created a powerful sense of equality in death that transcended the social hierarchies of life. The expansion of afterlife beliefs also led to changes in burial practices. While the wealthy could still afford elaborate tombs and extensive grave goods, even modest burials began to include the essential elements needed for the afterlife journey. Simple wooden coffins were decorated with excerpts from funerary texts. Basic sets of canopic jars were provided for the organs, and small collections of amulets were placed with the mummy to provide magical protection. The democratization of death also led to the development of new forms of religious expression. Popular festivals celebrating the dead became more elaborate and inclusive, allowing all members of society to participate in the cult of the ancestors. The beautiful Feast of the Valley, originally a royal festival, became a time when families of all social classes could visit the tombs of their relatives and celebrate their continued existence in the afterlife. This transformation of Egyptian afterlife beliefs represents one of the most significant religious developments in human history. The idea that eternal life was available to all people, regardless of their social status, was revolutionary for its time and would later influence other religious traditions. The Egyptian belief in the moral requirements for eternal life, symbolized by the weighing of the heart, established the principle that the afterlife was determined by one's actions in life rather than by birth or wealth. The Egyptian relationship with animals was unique in the ancient world, characterized by a deep reverence and belief in their sacred nature. This special bond extended beyond life into the afterlife, where beloved animals were believed to join their human companions in eternal paradise. The mummification and burial of animals, from household pets to sacred temple animals, reveals a sophisticated understanding of the spiritual nature of all living beings. The practice of animal mummification began early in Egyptian history and reached extraordinary levels of sophistication and scale. Cats, dogs, birds, crocodiles, bulls, and even insects were carefully preserved using techniques similar to those used for humans. The ancient Egyptians believed that animals possessed souls just like humans, and that these souls required the same careful preparation for the afterlife journey. Household pets held a special place in Egyptian society and in their owners' afterlife plans. Cats, in particular, were revered not only as practical companions who protected homes from rodents and snakes, but as sacred beings connected to the goddess Bastet. When a beloved cat died, the entire household would go into mourning, shaving their eyebrows as a sign of grief. The cat would be mummified with great care, wrapped in fine linen, and often provided with a painted wooden mask. Small mummified mice were sometimes placed in the cat's wrappings, ensuring that it would have prey to hunt in the afterlife. Dogs were equally cherished as loyal companions and guardians. Egyptian tomb paintings frequently show the deceased's favorite dog lying beneath their chair or accompanying them on hunting expeditions in the marshes. These faithful animals were mummified and buried with their owners, often in the same tomb or in adjacent burial chambers. The belief was that the bond between human and animal was so strong that it would continue in the afterlife, where they would be reunited to enjoy eternal companionship. The sacred animals maintained in temples represented an even more elaborate form of animal worship. The Apis bull, worshipped at Memphis as a living incarnation of the god Ptah, lived in luxury in the temple complex, tended by priests and worshipped by pilgrims from throughout Egypt. When an Apis bull died, it was mummified with the same care given to a pharaoh and buried in a massive stone sarcophagus in the underground galleries of the Serapeum. The funeral of an Apis bull was a national event, with elaborate processions and mourning rituals that could last for months. The ibis birds, sacred to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, were maintained in vast numbers at temple complexes throughout Egypt. When these birds died, they were mummified and buried in enormous underground catacombs. The scale of these burials is staggering. Archaeologists have discovered catacombs containing millions of mummified ibises, each carefully wrapped and placed in pottery jars. The sheer number of these burials suggests that the mummification of sacred animals had become a major industry, employing thousands of embalmers and generating substantial income for the temples. Crocodiles, sacred to the god Sobek, were kept in temple pools and treated with great reverence. These powerful predators were adorned with golden jewelry and fed choice offerings by the priests. When they died, they were mummified and buried in elaborate tombs, often accompanied by their eggs and young. The mummified crocodiles found in Egyptian tombs range from tiny hatchlings to massive adults over 15 feet long, all preserved with meticulous care. The process of animal mummification varied depending on the size and importance of the creature. Small animals, like cats and birds, were often mummified whole, their bodies carefully positioned and wrapped to maintain their natural shape. Larger animals, like bulls and crocodiles, required more complex procedures, with the internal organs removed, and the body cavity packed with preservative materials, just like human mummies. The religious significance of animal mummification went beyond simple preservation. The Egyptians believed that animals were manifestations of divine power, each species connected to specific gods and goddesses. By mummifying and properly burying these sacred creatures, the Egyptians were ensuring that their divine essence would continue to exist in the afterlife, where they could continue to serve their associated deities. The afterlife destination for animals was generally believed to be the same field of reeds that awaited righteous humans. Tomb paintings often show the deceased enjoying the company of their pets in paradise, hunting together in eternal marshlands, or relaxing together in beautiful gardens. The animals in these scenes appear healthy, young, and vigorous, restored to their prime condition for eternity. The emotional bond between Egyptians and their animals is evident in the inscriptions found on animal coffins and in tomb paintings. Pet cats and dogs were given personal names and were mourned with genuine grief when they died. Some tomb inscriptions include prayers for the deceased's pets, asking the gods to care for them in the afterlife and to reunite them with their beloved owners. This reverence for animal life extended to wild animals as well. The Egyptians believed that all animals possessed a spark of divinity and deserved respect and protection. Hunting was practiced, the forces of chaos, rather than simple sport or sustenance gathering. The legacy of Egyptian animal worship influenced later religious traditions and continues to resonate today. The idea that animals possess souls and deserve respectful treatment after death was revolutionary for its time and represents one of the earliest expressions of what we might now call animal rights. The elaborate care taken in preserving and burying animals demonstrates a level of compassion and spiritual sophistication that speaks to the depth of Egyptian religious thought. Food played a central role in Egyptian afterlife beliefs, not merely as sustenance for the physical body, but as a fundamental requirement for the continued existence of the soul in the next world. The elaborate provisions made for feeding the dead reveal a sophisticated understanding of the spiritual nature of nourishment and the importance of maintaining the bonds between the living and the deceased through the sharing of meals. The Egyptian concept of spiritual nourishment was based on the belief that the Ka, or life force, required regular sustenance to maintain its existence in the afterlife. This sustenance could come from actual food offerings left by the living, from magical substitutes created through art and ritual, or from the eternal abundance provided in the field of reeds. The tomb was designed as a complete household for the deceased, including kitchens, storage areas, and dining rooms where the Ka could enjoy its meals for eternity. Bread, the staff of life in ancient Egypt, was the most essential offering. Loaves of bread, from the grinding of grain to the baking of loaves, but special ceremonial loaves baked in sacred shapes and blessed by priests. Beer, the national drink of Egypt, was equally important in afterlife provisions. Large pottery jars filled with beer were standard tomb equipment, and brewing scenes were commonly depicted in tomb paintings. The beer of the afterlife was described as being perfectly brewed, never sour or flat, providing eternal refreshment for the deceased. The combination of bread and beer represented the basic sustenance needed for eternal life, and the offering formula always began with the phrase, "an offering of bread." Meat was a luxury in life, and remained so in death. The wealthy were buried with joints of beef, goose, duck, and other meats, carefully preserved and wrapped like mummies. The poor might be provided with symbolic representations of meat or with the actual bones of sacrificed animals. The type and quantity of meat in a tomb was a clear indicator of the deceased's social status and wealth. Fruits and vegetables added variety and symbolic meaning to the afterlife diet. Dates, figs, grapes, onions, garlic, and lettuce were commonly found in tombs. Each of these foods had religious significance beyond their nutritional value. Dates were associated with rebirth and regeneration, figs with fertility and abundance, and lettuce with the god Min and sexual potency. The inclusion of these foods ensured that the deceased would enjoy not only sustenance, but also the symbolic benefits associated with each type of food. The preparation and presentation of food for the dead was as important as the food itself. Elaborate serving dishes, cups, and utensils were placed in tombs, allowing the deceased to dine in style for eternity. The finest tombs included complete sets of dining furniture, including tables, chairs, and even napkins, creating a perfect dining environment for the afterlife. The magical transformation of food offerings was a crucial aspect of Egyptian funerary religion. The offering ritual, performed by priests or family members, involved the recitation of specific formulas that magically multiplied the physical offerings into an eternal supply. A single loaf of bread could be transformed into thousands of loaves, and a jar of beer could become thousands of jars. This magical multiplication ensured that the deceased would never go hungry, regardless of how long their family continued to provide actual offerings. The artistic representations of food in tomb paintings and reliefs served as magical substitutes for actual offerings. These images were not merely decorative, but were believed to be magically activated by the offering formulas, providing real sustenance for the QA. The walls of Egyptian tombs are covered with images of elaborate feasts, showing tables laden with bread, meat, fruits, and vegetables, all available for the deceased's eternal consumption. The social aspects of dining were also preserved in the afterlife. Tomb paintings often show the deceased enjoying meals with their family members, both living and dead. The deceased could host dinner parties for their ancestors and welcome newly deceased family members to join their eternal feast. The festivals of the dead provided opportunities for the living to share meals with their deceased relatives. During the beautiful Feast of the Valley and other celebrations, the burial chambers, these shared meals strengthened the bonds between the living and the dead and ensured that the deceased, anything available in the mortal world. The bread was always fresh and perfectly baked. This perfect food was one of the rewards of righteous living and successful passage through the trials of the underworld. The abundance of food in the field of reeds was legendary. The crops grew to enormous size without any effort from the deceased, and the harvests were perpetual. The grain stalks were described as being 7 cubits tall and the ears of grain were 3 cubits long. This supernatural abundance ensured that no one in the afterlife would ever experience hunger or want. The eternal feast of the afterlife represented the ultimate fulfillment of one of humanity's most basic needs. In a world where famine and hunger were constant threats, the promise of eternal abundance was profoundly comforting. The elaborate provisions made for feeding the dead demonstrate the central importance of food in Egyptian culture, and the belief that the pleasures of the table were too important to be limited to mortal life. The ultimate goal of all Egyptian funerary practices was not merely to ensure survival in the afterlife, but to achieve true immortality through eternal remembrance. The Egyptians understood that death could be conquered not only through the preservation of the body and the soul's journey to paradise, but through the preservation of memory, name, and legacy in the world of the living. This understanding drove them to create some of the most enduring monuments in human history. The concept of the name as a vital component of existence was fundamental to Egyptian thought. The name, or ren, was considered one of the essential parts of a person's being, as important as the ka or ba. To have one's name spoken and remembered was to continue to exist in a very real sense. Conversely, to have one's name forgotten or deliberately erased was to suffer a form of death that was even more final than physical death. This belief explains the Egyptian obsession with inscribing names on monuments, tombs, and objects, and the practice of damnatio memoria, the deliberate erasure of names from monuments as the ultimate punishment for those who had fallen from favor. The construction of monuments was therefore not an act of vanity, but a religious necessity. Every statue, every temple, every tomb was designed to preserve the name and memory of its creator for eternity. The pharaohs built on a scale that defies comprehension, creating monuments so massive and durable that they would survive the collapse of their civilization and continue to proclaim their names to future generations. The pyramids of Giza, the temples of Karnak and Luxor, and the rock-cut tombs of the Valley of the Kings all serve as eternal testimonies to the individuals who created them. The hieroglyphic inscriptions that cover these monuments are not merely decorative, but are powerful magical texts designed to ensure the eternal existence of those they commemorate. The offering formulas carved on tomb walls continue to provide sustenance for the deceased as long as they can be read. The biographical inscriptions preserve the deeds and achievements of the dead, ensuring that their accomplishments will be remembered forever. The religious texts guide the soul through the afterlife and proclaim its successful transformation into a divine being. The artistic representations found in tombs and temples serve a similar function. The painted and carved images of the deceased are not portraits in the modern sense, but are magical substitutes for the person themselves. These images allow the Ka to manifest itself in the physical world and to receive the offerings and worship of the living. The scenes of daily life that decorate tomb walls are not mere decoration, but are magical recreations of the deceased's earthly existence, allowing them to continue their favorite activities for eternity. The scale and permanence of Egyptian monuments reflect a deep understanding of the relationship between memory and immortality. The Egyptians knew that individual human memory is fragile and short-lived, but that stone and bronze could preserve. names and images for thousands of years. They invested enormous resources in creating monuments that would outlast not only their own lives, but the lives of their children and their children's children, ensuring that their names would be spoken by people they could never have imagined. The democratization of monument building paralleled the democratization of the afterlife. While the great pyramids and temples were reserved for pharaohs and gods, smaller monuments became available to nobles, officials, and eventually to anyone who could afford them. Stele or stone monuments could be erected in temple courtyards or cemeteries, providing a permanent record of the deceased's name and achievements. These monuments often included offering formulas that would magically provide sustenance for the deceased as long as the stone endured. The maintenance of monuments was as important as their construction. Temples employed staffs of priests whose duties included keeping the inscriptions clean and legible, repairing damage from weather and age, and ensuring that the magical texts remained effective. The restoration of ancient monuments was considered a pious act that would earn the restorer divine favor. Many pharaohs gained religious merit by restoring the monuments of their predecessors, adding their own names to the inscriptions as codedic. The power of monuments to preserve memory is demonstrated by the survival of Egyptian civilization in the modern world. Although the last native pharaoh died over 2,000 years ago, and the ancient Egyptian language ceased to be spoken over a millennium ago, the monuments of Egypt continue to proclaim the names and achievements of their builders. Tourists from around the world travel to Egypt to see the pyramids and temples, unconsciously participating in the ancient Egyptian cult of memory by reading the names and viewing the images of people who died thousands of years ago. The influence of Egyptian monument building spread throughout the ancient world and continues to influence architecture and art today. The concept of the monument as a means of achieving immortality became a fundamental part of human culture, inspiring the construction of everything from Greek temples to Roman triumphal arches to modern war memorials. The Egyptian understanding that physical monuments could preserve memory and ensure a form of immortality has become one of their most enduring legacies. The ultimate success of Egyptian monument building is evident in the fact that we are still talking about these ancient people today. The pharaohs achieved their goal of eternal remembrance. Their names are still spoken, and their images are still viewed with awe and wonder. In this sense, they truly did conquer death, not through magic or divine intervention, but through the simple yet profound act of creating something permanent in an impermanent world. As our journey through the Egyptian understanding of death and the afterlife draws to its close, and the gentle rhythm of your breathing carries you toward the peaceful shores of sleep, we find ourselves contemplating the profound wisdom and enduring relevance of these ancient beliefs. The Egyptians, in their quest to conquer death, created not only magnificent monuments and elaborate rituals, but a comprehensive philosophy of life, death, and meaning that continues to resonate with the human spirit thousands of years after their civilization passed into history. The Egyptian vision of death was fundamentally optimistic. Unlike many cultures that viewed death as a terrifying unknown or a final ending, the Egyptians saw it as a transition, a doorway to a better existence. Their afterlife was not a shadowy, underworld or a place of punishment, but a perfected version of the life they knew and loved. The field of reeds was Egypt itself, but Egypt without suffering, without want, without end. This vision reflects a deep appreciation for the beauty and value of earthly existence, coupled with an unshakable faith that the good things in life were too precious to be lost to death. The moral dimension of Egyptian afterlife beliefs established principles that remain relevant today. The weighing of the heart ceremony, with its emphasis on truth, justice, and ethical behavior, represents one of humanity's earliest and most sophisticated expressions of moral accountability. The idea that one's fate in the afterlife depends not on birth, wealth, or social status, but on how one has lived, was revolutionary for its time and continues to influence religious and ethical thought today. The Egyptian understanding of the soul, with its multiple components and complex interactions, reveals a psychological sophistication that anticipates modern insights into the nature of human consciousness and identity. The concept of the Kia as a spiritual double, the Ba as the unique personality, and the Ak as the transformed divine self, provides a framework for understanding the different aspects of human existence that remains remarkably relevant. The elaborate care taken in preserving the physical body through mummification reflects a deep respect for the human form and an understanding of the word connection between physical and spiritual existence. While modern science has moved beyond the need for mummification, the Egyptian insight that the body is more than mere matter, that it is intimately connected to identity and consciousness, continues to inform our understanding of human nature. The Egyptian emphasis on memory and remembrance as forms of immortality speaks to a fundamental human need that transcends cultural and temporal boundaries, the desire to be remembered, to leave a lasting legacy, to ensure that one's life had meaning and impact, is as strong today as it was in ancient Egypt. The monuments they built and the names they carved in stone represent humanity's eternal struggle against oblivion, a struggle that continues in every photograph we take, every story we tell, and every act of love we perform. The democratization of the afterlife in Egyptian thought represents one of the most significant developments in human religious consciousness. The evolution from a system where only pharaohs could achieve divine status after death to one where every person, regardless of social position, could aspire to eternal life, reflects a growing understanding of human dignity and worth. This development laid the groundwork for later religious traditions that would emphasize the equal spiritual value of all human beings. The Egyptian relationship with animals and their inclusion in afterlife beliefs demonstrates a level of compassion and spiritual awareness that was far ahead of its time. The belief that animals possessed souls and deserved respectful treatment in death, as well as life, represents an early recognition of the interconnectedness of all living beings and the responsibility humans have toward other creatures. As you drift now into the deepest stages of sleep, let the wisdom of the ancient Egyptians settle gently in your mind. Their understanding that death is not an ending but a transformation, that love transcends the grave, that memory is a form of immortality, and that a life lived with truth and justice is a life well lived, offers comfort and guidance that is as relevant today as it was 4,000 years ago. the ancient Egyptians faced the same fundamental questions that confront every human being. What happens when we die? Is there meaning to existence? How should we live? Their answers, expressed through magnificent art, elaborate rituals, and enduring monuments, continue to inspire and comfort us. They remind us that while our physical bodies are temporary, the love we share, the good we do, and the beauty we create can indeed achieve a form of immortality. In the end, the greatest achievement of Egyptian civilization was not their pyramids or their gold, but their unwavering belief in the value and continuity of human existence. They refused to accept that death was the final word, and in their refusal, they created a vision of hope and meaning that has outlasted their empire and continues to illuminate the human journey as the last echoes of our exploration fade into the gentle silence of the night. May you find in your dreams your own field of reeds, a place of peace, beauty, and eternal rest. May you wake refreshed and renewed, carrying with you the ancient Egyptian understanding that every day is a gift, every moment is precious, and every life has the potential for immortality through love, memory, and the enduring impact of a life well lived. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of an eternal human story, a story that began in the mists of prehistory and will continue long after we are gone. A story in which every individual life has meaning, value, and the potential for a form of immortality that transcends the boundaries of time and space. The ancient Egyptians understood this truth, and in understanding it, they achieved the very immortality they sought. Their names are still spoken, their stories are still told, and their wisdom continues to guide us on our own journey toward the eternal dawn.